Welcome back to the latest edition of Tune Diving. This is the Indo-Answers, and today we'll be exploring Adam Rapa's brilliant trumpet solo in the A.R. Rahman composition Tu Bole from the Hindi film Jaane Diya Jaane Na. This is the second video of a two-video series. The first video explored the chord progression that this solo is based on. In this second video though, we're just going to analyze the solo itself and what makes it so effective. So if you haven't watched the first video, please do go check that out. But for this video, we're going to stick with the solo and we're going to analyze what makes this trumpet solo so effective and so cool. So with all that said, without further ado, let's jump right in. In this video, we're just going to take the trumpet solo from beginning to end, and we're going to look at the features that make it so impactful. Let's start with the first four measures. Now, obviously, it's the first four measures, it's just the beginning. You'd want to kind of ease your way in and not do too many strange or chaotic things. If you do too many strange and chaotic things near the beginning, that may unnecessarily confuse the audience too early on. Therefore, Adam Rapa mainly sticks to the home key of G major in these first four measures. However, he also includes certain small phrases to make sure that his solo matches with the chord progression. So let's look at how he does both of these things. Looking at the first four measures, except for the first note in measure 4, he sticks to the G major scale. The G major scale, the scale that the song in general is based on. And so sticking to that G major scale in the beginning helps us listeners ease into the solo and make sure not to confuse us. And notice, this isn't necessarily something obvious because there are chords like B7, for example, which would lead to a scale that is very different from the original G major scale. If he stuck completely to that B7 chord in measure 2, for example, instead of a C, we might have a C sharp, or instead of a G, we might have a G sharp. But he doesn't get carried away by the chords. His aim in general in the beginning is to stick to that home base, that foundation of G major. And so he doesn't get carried away by the chords and he doesn't do anything strange or chaotic. But he can't ignore the chords completely. If he ignores the chords completely, then the solo may not match the chord progression. Therefore, he has little two-note phrases that match with the corresponding chord. Specifically, these two-note phrases would contain chord tones with the relevant chord. So, for example, in measure 1 is based on the chord of G major. And if you look at the opening of measure 1, it starts with the notes B and D, right? B and D are both chord tones in the chord of G major. And so we see how he's creating that two-note phrase with two of the chord tones. Something similar happens in measure 2. Measure 2 is based on the chord B7. B7 has chord tones B, D sharp, F sharp, and A. And we hear that two-note phrase B and F sharp in beat 2 of measure 2, right? So again, we have that little two-note phrase consisting of two chord tones. Measure 3, it only has one note, so he can't create a two-note phrase, but that one note is actually a chord tone. That one note is G, and G is a chord tone in the A minor 7 chord. In measure 4, something similar happens compared to measures 1 and 2. Once again, we have that little two-note phrase consisting of chord tones from the relevant chord. So measure 4 is based on the chord E flat major 7, which has chord tones E flat, G, B flat, and D. And the opening of measure 4, the first two notes of measure 4 is B flat and G. Right, so once again we have that little two-note phrase consisting of two of the chord tones from the relevant chords. So therefore, in this opening, we see how Adam Rapa strikes a really cool balance between kind of sticking to the home scale of G major in order to make sure not to startle the audience too much, but also infusing these little phrases that connect with the relevant chords. So he strikes this balance between sticking to the home scale while also kind of crafting a solo in a way that corresponds with the chord progression. Now, measure 4 is where he brings in the first accidental. It's from here where the wackiness of the solo is starting to build. And so this accidental kind of prepares our ears for the journey that the solo is about to go on. If you look at the next part of the solo, there's a few accidentals and it kind of departs from the comfortable home base of G major. And so having this accidental kind of prepares our ears and eases that transition into the next part of the solo. Also, notice that the note he is holding at the end is a high D. This is the highest note we've heard in the solo so far, and this high note is held across multiple beats. And so this high note actually helps our ears prepare for the next part of the solo, because the next part of the solo is going to be played at a much higher pitch compared to the beginning of the solo. So having this high note and holding this high note, not super high note, but a slightly high note, it kind of eases that transition into the part of the solo which is going to be based on a higher pitch, right? So measure 4 is kind of this really useful transition measure, right? He's introducing accidentals, getting our ears used to an accidental, and he's also kind of lifting the range of the solo a little bit, going bit by bit a little bit higher, right? And that eases the transition into the next part of the solo, which is going to be based on a higher pitch, right? So measure 4 is a really good kind of transition measure in order to make sure that the next part of the solo doesn't startle us or confuse us too much. Speaking of high pitches, let's take a look at measure 6 until 8. Where the pitch really starts to get high, right? So measure 6 until 8 is based on a much higher pitch compared to the beginning of the solo. And measure 6 until 8 is really where the chaos starts to kick in. Let's start with measure 6. The beginning of measure 6 is very interesting actually. The beginning of measure 6 is silent. Adam Rapa doesn't play anything. I mean, the background keeps going, but Adam Rapa doesn't play anything at the beginning of measure 6. And I personally think that this is for a specific reason. If we look at the chord associated with measure 6, it's an F-sharp 7 chord. And the F-sharp 7 chord carries a lot of tension because, compared to our home key of G major, F-sharp 7 doesn't share any common chord tones. Plus, if we look at the F-sharp 7 chord, 2 of the notes aren't even in the G major scale. And so F-sharp 7 is very kind of dissonant and it carries a lot of tension. And so when this chord is played, it's kind of a signal to us audience saying, hey, we're going to build up the tension now. And by leaving that part of the solo silent, we hear this chord clearly, right? Because the solo is silent, we don't hear the solo, so our attention goes straight to the chord. And because our attention goes straight to the chord, we hear the message that this chord is delivering clearly. And the message that this chord delivers is hey, we have a lot of tension right now. We're going to build up the tension here, right? Because this is a very kind of tension-heavy chord, right? So by leaving the beginning of measure 6 silent, we hear this chord, the F-sharp 7 chord, more clearly. And that prepares our ears for more tension because this chord has a lot of tension. And so personally, that's why I think the beginning of measure 6 is silent, in order to make sure that we hear that chord clearly and in order to get our ears used to tension because the next part of the solo is going to have a lot of tension. And so it gets our ears used to that tension. Now, with this F sharp 7 chord, because it is a very dissonant and high tension chord, we expect a kind of chaotic or very different and high tension melody line to come next. And it does come, but it feels like Adam Rapa plays a short prank before that. We're expecting this chaotic line because we've had a chaotic chord. But the next phrase he plays, or the phrase he plays in measure 6, is a phrase that is fully in the key of G major. So, it sounds comfortable, G major. It's perfectly in line with G major. So this leaves us confused. The F sharp 7 chord promised a lot of tension, but then the phrase he's playing is very kind of comfortable and in line with our home key of G major. So what's going on? All he's doing is he's delaying the chaos a little bit. It was just a short prank, as I said before, because the chaos comes right afterwards in measures 7 and 8. Measure 7 and 8 is like one heck of a line, which truly feels like it's going all over the place. And I think there are 3 reasons why this line in measures 7 and 8 feels really chaotic. Firstly, the pitches played here are much higher than the previous sections of the song, like about 2 octaves higher, right? So much, much higher compared to the beginning section of the solo. And so this melody line being this high in pitch compared to the previous parts of the solo makes it feel like we're really departing from our comfort zone and we're really kind of going on this journey. Secondly, accidentals are used. Specifically, the note E flat is used, and the note E flat is not in the G major scale, so it's an accidental. So that's another feature, the usage of accidentals that adds tension to this line. However, I think the most significant feature that makes this line feel as chaotic as it does is rhythm. If we were to play this phrase in measures 7 and 8 perfectly in rhythm, however, in this solo, that's not what happens. So, Adam Rapa doesn't play perfectly in rhythm in measures 7 and 8. The first 2 notes are in rhythm, but the third note is a bit longer than it would be in a perfect rhythm. And so because the third note is a bit too long, everything else comes in a bit late, right? So it drags the whole phrase. And similarly, the 5th note of this phrase is also a bit too long, right? So, that the fact that these 2 notes are a bit too long, it makes the whole phrase drag, right? And because this phrase drags, it goes off rhythm. And because it's going off rhythm, it creates tension, right? Because it's not ba, 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 ba. It's not perfect and comfortable. It's dragging. It's going off beat, right? And so, that creates tension and that contributes to the chaos that this section of the solo has. Now, in order to get back in rhythm, because the first bit was dragging, Adam Rapa needs to rush the second bit in order to get back in rhythm. So now he makes some of the notes shorter than it should be. The high C, for example, should be a quarter note in like a perfect rhythm, but Adam Rapa shrinks it down to like a 16th note seemingly. And the G and D should be 8th notes, but those seem to be cut short too. So the key here is that because the first section was dragging, now this kind of second section, he has to rush it in order to get back in rhythm. So as I said, the important thing to note here is that Adam Rapa initially drags and then rushes. He's initially behind the beat and then he needs to rush a little bit in order to get back in rhythm. And I personally don't think he was thinking like, oh, I'm going to make this specific note exactly this much longer, or that specific note exactly this much shorter. I don't think he was thinking that technically. I think he was just thinking like, hey, I want to create some tension because, we have these high notes and we have these accidentals. So let's add to the tension by just going a bit off rhythm. Let's just drag it a little bit, in order to create that tension. And then in order to get back into rhythm, he had to rush that second bit. So in measure 7 and 8, I think it's those three things that contribute to the kind of chaos that we feel. It's, the high pitch, the accidentals, but most importantly, in my opinion, it's, the dragging that really contributes to the chaos that we feel. The way I look at measures 6, 7, and 8 is kind of like a roller coaster. That's the kind of analogy that comes to my head. I don't know if any of you have seen one of those roller coasters where it stops at the top right before it falls, right? So it doesn't fall directly, it just kind of stops at the top for a second and then it falls. And this passage between measure 6, 7, and 8 kind of reminds me of that kind of roller coaster. At the start of measure 6, we have the F sharp 7 chord. It signals kind of danger, it signals tension. And that's the moment where you see that you're about to fall. Right? So you see the drop, you see that the chaos that's about to come, right? But then at measure 6, Adam Rapa plays this phrase that's fully based on G major, right? So that's kind of like the moment where the roller coaster stops at the top, right? You think you're about to descend into chaos, but it doesn't quite happen. Like you just kind of stop and the chaos that you expected doesn't come. But then right after that, we have this, chaotic melody line in measures 7 and 8, right? Which goes, really high in pitch. It uses accidentals. It goes off rhythm and it's just full of chaos, right? And so that's the moment where you fall on the roller coaster, right? So I don't know if this analogy makes sense, but hopefully it does. But, measure 6, 7, and 8 really kind of makes me feel that kind of analogy. And, I just love these features that Adam Rapa has put into the solo in order to engage us listeners. So now let's take a look at the second half of the solo, and specifically let's look at measures 9, 10, and 11. And if you take a look at these three measures, we can kind of divide it into three distinct phrases. And, these three phrases, these three consecutive phrases, they all end on the same note, E, right? And, this technique of ending multiple consecutive phrases on the same note is actually a relatively common technique in jazz. And, here's an example I'll play for you. It's from Chet Baker's solo from the song Pent Up House. In this example of, the solo from Chet Baker, and in this section we're looking at from Bole, the solo ends multiple phrases, multiple consecutive phrases on the same note. And this is essentially repetition, right? It's repeating a feature over and over. And I think repetition in these kinds of cases can help build anticipation, right? If something repeats over and over, we know that it can't go on forever, right? He can't just keep repeating, same thing forever. At some point, something has to change. We know that. At some point, this repetition has to finish. And so that builds anticipation because we anticipate the moment where this repetition ends and where something changes. And the change that Adam Rapa brings after this period of repetition is a really cool change, actually. Now, another important feature I should mention in order for us to understand the shift that Adam Rapa is about to give us is that between measures 9 and 11, at least ignoring like a couple of very short notes, all of the notes are from the G major scale. I just wanted to point that out because, that's going to help us understand the shift that Adam Rapa brings in measure 12. So Adam Rapa gives us the shift that I'm talking about in measure 12. And the shift that he gives us correlates perfectly with the chord measure 12 is set to. So in measure 12, we have the chord B flat 7, right? And the fact that we have B flat 7 as the chord allows us to use notes like, for example, B flat or E flat, because these notes work well with the B flat 7 chord. And that's exactly what he does. In measure 12, the phrase goes, right? So he uses the notes B flat and E flat. And so if we put that into context, measure 9 through 11 was mainly based on the G major scale, right? And the fact that Adam Rapa repeated the same ending note with each phrase ended on the note E, right? So that repetition built anticipation, right? So measures 9 through 11, it's set to G major, like the phrases are all kind of, based on the G major scale, but there's anticipation that Adam Rapa is building, anticipating a shift. And that shift is delivered beautifully. It's only a temporary shift, but that shift is delivered beautifully in measure 12 as Adam Rapa uses accidentals. He uses the notes B flat and E flat. Now, let's look at the final few measures. Which doesn't really introduce any new ideas. We're coming to the end of the solo, so Adam Rapa would kind of just want to wrap things up, close the solo, and he does that by mostly reusing ideas that he's already established in the solo so far. One feature that Adam Rapa uses in these final few measures that I haven't really talked about so far is the idea of starting phrases a little bit earlier than expected. So usually, melodies or phrases would start on beat 1, right? But in this case, Adam Rapa starts his phrases right before beat 1, right? So, starting his phrases right before beat 1 brings about a little bit of that rhythmic unexpectedness. It catches us off guard because the phrases are coming in just a little bit earlier than we might expect. So we expect it to fall on beat 1, but it actually starts right before beat 1. So that brings about a little bit of that rhythmic unexpectedness, and it grabs our attention a little bit. In addition, if we look at measures 13 and 15, we see that Adam Rapa revisits the idea of dragging and rushing. So if you remember in measures 7 and 8, in measure 7 he dragged a little bit, and then in measure 8 he rushed a little bit, right? So we explored the idea of dragging and rushing. And he kind of reintroduces that idea in the kind of final few measures of this solo as well. So, in this case, actually, he rushes and then drags, right? So instead of dragging first and then rushing, he actually rushes first and then drags. So I'll play it both ways, in like perfect rhythm and in the version that he's played it, so you can hear the difference. So hopefully you heard that kind of rushing and dragging that he does, right? He rushes at the beginning and then he drags a little bit. And by dragging at the end, he's kind of slowing things down. And as this is the end of the solo, slowing things down is kind of a nice way to just wrap things up, right? So this kind of rushing and dragging not only kind of revisits an idea he's done previously, although he switched the order. Initially it was dragging, then rushing. Now it's rushing, then dragging. So similar idea, but just switching the order. Not only does it do that, but by dragging at the end of the solo, it kind of wraps things up in a really nice way. So that's the solo. We've analyzed the whole solo. It's a short solo, but as you probably have noticed, there's a lot to notice and digest, and there's a lot of things to analyze in there. And we talked about a lot. We talked about how in measures 1 through 4 in the beginning, he strikes this balance between using the G major scale while also kind of inserting those 2-note phrases that matched with the corresponding chords. So we talked about that in the beginning. we talked about how measure 4 was kind of a transition, right? It used the accidental, so it prepared our ears for the accidentals that were going to come in the next section, and plus it introduced a slightly higher pitch, right? So it eased the transition from the kind of medium sort of pitch, like not too high, not too low, and it helped kind of smoothen that transition into, the next section, which goes high in pitch. So measure 4 was a very useful kind of transition measure. And then we looked at measures 6 through 8, which was a whole kind of, crazy emotional journey of its own. We talked about how in the beginning of measure 6, Adam Rapa initially leaves that opening beat silent, right? So that we could hear the F sharp 7 chord clearly. And that F sharp 7 chord communicated a lot of kind of tension and, dissonance, right? And while that chord communicated tension and dissonance, Adam Rapa played a short prank on us by playing a phrase that's fully kind of in line with the G major scale, right? So we had tension, but then we just had this brief kind of moment of confusion because, the chord implied tension, but the phrase that Adam Rapa played was not, very tense. It was just, perfectly set to G major. So measure 6 kind of brought about that confusion, but measure 7 and 8 went into full chaos mode because it goes very high in pitch, it uses accidentals, and, it utilizes that dragging and rushing that we talked about. Measures 9 until 12 was a whole, new interesting journey of its own, right? Because measures 9 through 11, it built anticipation by repeatedly ending each phrase on the note E, right? So, that built anticipation that made us listeners expect a change. And Adam Rapa delivered that change beautifully in measure 12 by using accidentals. Remember, measures 9 through 11 was mostly based on the G major scale, but measure 12 delivered a shift by using some accidentals. Finally, between measures 13 and 16, we looked at how Adam Rapa kind of revisited ideas that he's already used in the solo. We talked about how he starts his phrases a bit earlier than beat 1, which kind of brings in that rhythmic unexpectedness and which grabs our attention. And then we talked about how at the end of the solo, he rushes and then drags. So in measures 7 and 8, he dragged and then rushed. He was basically reusing the same idea except flipping the order. He rushed and then dragged, and by dragging at the end, it slows things down towards the end of the solo, and that kind of is a perfect way to wrap up the solo because it's kind of slowing down, signaling a kind of calm end to the solo. So yeah, that's a whole bunch of things we noticed in a relatively short solo, and it's a testament to his genius as an improviser that he's able to communicate so many emotions and take us through such an interesting emotional journey in such a short solo. So that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed both parts of this video, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments below if you have any thoughts or suggestions with regards to this video or future videos you want me to make. Thank you so much once again, and we'll see you next time.